y'all came out tonight to our event for our debate, Does God Exist? I'm Madison Marston, president of Ratio Christi. We have a chapter here at UNCW. We're student apologetics. We believe that truth can be determined and we can know truth, right? And we can know it based on science and logic and reason and scripture. And so tonight we like to bring events such as this one every semester. We bring speakers who kind of share their defenses for what they believe. And because we like to have conversations and bring students together on campus to discuss these things that have been discussed for centuries, right? Does God exist? Is there morality? Does truth exist? And so, again, tonight we have another event just like that. So I'm glad you all came. I would also like to mention that after our debate tonight, there will be a question and answer. So I want all of us to be thinking of really good questions. We also understand that you might not be able to stay for the whole thing. We won't yell at you for leaving. But before you go, we wanted to mention to you that we will be going, and you are all invited, to Ale House. It's just take a ride on College Road, for an after party, if you might say, to continue our discussion beyond just this formal debate and outside. So now I would also like to go ahead and bring up to you our moderator for the evening. Our moderator, Rick Olson. He was a graduate here at UNCW, and he has returned, and he's now a professor in the communications department, and he's also the head of the chair. So I would like to bring him up now, Rick Olson.
Comedian Stephen Wright once said, "I have a large seashell collection, which I have scattered on beaches all over the world." This is funny because we know it's not true. It is also funny because he adapts his explanation of the world around him in a way that puts him at the center. But we're all guilty of that, aren't we? We all have a tendency to struggle with this. Tonight we are tackling both truth and explanation by exploring the question, God or atheism, where does the evidence point? This question is the single most important question we could ask because the answer, as numerous writers on both sides have noted, informs the rest of our explanations. And because of its wide-ranging implications, it must remain a question we can ask in the public sphere and in forums like this one that we have tonight. And I'm sure all of us, regardless of which side we're on, are thankful that we live in a country, state, and university that allows us to speak so freely about these issues. Linguist Alfred Korzybski said, "There are two ways to slice easily through life, to believe everything and to doubt everything. Both ways save us from thinking. But tonight, you will not be rescued by either of those positions. You will be called on to think. The cynics have no advantages over the naive tonight. You will also be called on to be civil, critical thinkers. It is our hope that tonight's debate may also foster a wonderful internal dialogue within your mind. But please keep such dialogue internal so that others can listen and reason for themselves." Hold on just a second. What? No. No, I'm just moderating a debate. No, it's just about whether God exists or not. No big what. My wife said, turn off your cell phone. Okay, thank you. Please, turn off your cell phone. In a society where media focuses on the sensational sound bites, tonight may feel quite strange. Tonight we will hear what have historically been known as fully developed arguments in the context of civil debate. With that in mind, here's a playbook for what an argument looks like. There's a claim. That's a statement we can agree or disagree with. And then there's support for that claim, which we often call data. And then there's the reasoning that links the claim and the support. That can be logic, theories, basic assumptions about worldview, etc. Pay attention for these as you listen. Debates are intended to highlight differences as well as common ground. But in a debate, we look to emphasize those areas where we clash or differ because this clash should ultimately help listeners to clarify their thinking. That's the goal of the clash. Let me briefly introduce tonight's debaters, and then I'll talk about the order of the debate, and then we'll get started. They are being introduced in alphabetical order. So arguing for atheism is Mr. Phillip Drum. Mr. Drum is the former president of the UNCG Atheist, Agnostic, and Skeptics, and he resides in Wilmington. Welcome. Arguing for the existence of God is Dr. Wallace Marshall. He is the director of the Charleston, South Carolina chapter of Reasonable Faith, a Christian apologetics organization with 40 chapters throughout the United States and 7 international chapters. He received his master's in divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and his PhD from Boston College, where he studied the historical interaction between science, religion, and philosophy in the West. Welcome, Dr. Marshall. Let me briefly let you know what's coming up. In a debate, we typically have what are called constructives, which is where each person gets to lay out their major claims. And Dr. Marshall will have his constructive, followed by Mr. Drum. Then we have what we call rebuttals, which are chances to challenge the cases that just got laid out. And again, we will have Marshall and then Drum. And then we will have an opportunity for some counter rebuttal and some cross-examination. And then there'll be a time for question and answer. And then after we've all had a chance to get thoroughly complicated in our thinking, they'll have a chance to kind of pull some closure in with some closing remarks. George Gallup is reported to have said, "I could prove God statistically." But what fun would that be, right? So, gentlemen, let's begin our engagement. Dr. Marshall, you're up. Mr. Drum, you're on deck.
Well, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Great to see such a strong turnout to consider such an important question. I look forward especially to the Q&A session after our debate. And for those of you who are particularly hardy, sitting opposite you at the Carolina Ale House into the wee hours of the night. I want to share with you 3 arguments for the existence of God in my opening speech. I picked these 3 arguments both because I think they're very powerful and because they draw on a wide range of evidence, philosophical, scientific, and evidence from our moral experience. They're also the kind of arguments that are relatively simple to explain, and therefore they're appropriate for a gathering like this. My first argument is what's known as the Kalam cosmological argument, and it runs like this. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. This is a premise that I would hope doesn't need much arguing for. It's simply a restatement of the ancient philosophical maxim, ex nihilo nihil fit. From nothing, nothing comes. A corollary of this would be something now is, therefore something has always been, which, as I like to say to people, is one of the most elementary, simple, and yet profound philosophical conclusions that we can reach about reality. Given the existence of anything at all, a lump of clay, or this laser pointer in my hand, or a piece of paper, or even a dust mite, it follows, since nothing can come from nothing, that something has always been. And the question naturally arises, what is that eternal something? And there are 3 possibilities. Either the material universe, God, or some transcendent cause of the universe, call it what you will, or God and the material universe, both coexisting from past eternity. So how do we assess these 3 options? That leads to the second premise of the argument: the universe began to exist, which I'd like to support first with 2 philosophical reasons. The first of them you see up there is that you run into all kinds of absurdities if you suppose that an infinite number of things exist. And if the universe is past eternal, there'd be an infinite series of past events. Now, there are lots of fun examples that you can use to show this, and in the interest of time, I'm going to bypass giving you those unless my opponent here wants to maintain that an actual infinite can exist. But suffice it to say that mathematicians and philosophers are well aware that while the use of infinites is well established in mathematical theory, the existence of an actual infinite cannot occur without running us into all kinds of logical absurdities and contradictions. As David Hilbert, perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, says, the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea. Herb Silverman, who represented the atheist position in a debate against William Lane Craig here several years ago, similarly says about his early mathematical education, "The most important lesson I learned was that infinity is a theoretical construct and that the number infinity does not exist in reality." The second reason for supposing that the universe is not past eternal is the impossibility of completing an infinite series by adding one member after another. Now, it's easy to see that if you were immortal and were to begin counting today, that you could never reach infinity, because for any one number you could count, there'd always be another number beyond that that you could count, and so you would never approach infinity. Well, my argument here is that the same logic applies to counting backwards from negative infinity. If someone were counting down from negative infinity and they got to -3, if they got to -3, -2, -1, 0, and they just finished right then, you could ask, well, why didn't you finish 2 weeks earlier, or 2 years ago, or 200 years? Because at any past point along that cycle, they would have had an infinite amount of time to complete their countdown. This philosophical conclusion about the finitude of the universe has been remarkably confirmed by scientific evidence over the past 4 or 5 decades as scientists have explored the implications of what is commonly known as the Big Bang. Now, the Big Bang is sometimes misunderstood as a primordial explosion that occurred within pre-existing space-time. But as any cosmologist will tell you, the Big Bang actually refers to the origin of everything, matter, energy, space, and time, at a definite point in the finite past. As Stephen Hawking says, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Efforts to avoid this absolute beginning have all proved unsuccessful, and in 2003, 3 prominent cosmologists, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, were able to demonstrate that any universe or multiverse that has on average been expanding throughout its history, and that applies to all of our viable cosmological models, cannot be eternal in the past, but has to have an absolute beginning. Listen to how Vilenkin describes the implications of their findings. "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." About a year and a half ago, a number of eminent cosmologists and physicists gathered in Cambridge to celebrate Stephen Hawking's 70th birthday party. At the conclusion of tonight's debate, those of you who are interested can pick up an article that I have here from New Scientist magazine that describes this gathering. Now, as some of you may be aware, Stephen Hawking is a strident atheist, and as such has been very intent on trying to find some way of avoiding an absolute beginning as posited by the Big Bang. In fact, at this gathering, Stephen Hawking expressly stated that his motivation for avoiding this absolute beginning was that he didn't want to have to appeal to the hand of a creator, which he rightly saw would otherwise be the case. However, all of the papers that were presented at Hawking's birthday party merely confirmed the 2003 Bord-Guth-Vilenkin theorem that I mentioned a few moments ago. In fact, the article begins by saying you could call them the worst birthday presents ever, referring to the presentations that were given at Hawking's birthday party. The article goes on to explain the various reasons why cosmological models cannot be extended to past infinity, and it concludes by quoting Vilenkin, who was at this conference, "All the evidence we have says the universe had a beginning." Even Lawrence Krauss, a strident atheist who has played all kinds of absurd word games to try to avoid this absolute beginning, was compelled to concede a few months ago, "I would agree. All the evidence says the universe had a beginning." So those are the two premises of the argument, and if they are true, the conclusion necessarily follows, therefore, the universe has a cause. So is there any reason to think that this cause is God? I think so. Consider the nature that this cause must have. First of all, it has to be immaterial, spaceless, and timeless, because whatever it is brought matter, space, and time into being. It must be immensely powerful to have brought the universe into being out of nothing. Finally, it's a plausibly personal being in the sense of being a mind or intelligent agent for two reasons. First of all, the only immaterial, spaceless, timeless entities that we know of are abstract objects and unembodied minds. But abstract objects can't cause anything. That's part of the definition of what it means to be an abstract object. The number 7 or a triangle can't cause anything. It's causally effete, as philosophers would say. So that leaves an unembodied mind as the only alternative. And one final reason for supposing that this cause is personal is that if the cause were impersonal, just some kind of mechanical cause, then one would expect the effect to be eternally present with it, which in the nature of the case, it isn't. My next argument is based on the fine-tuning of the universe. Fine-tuning is a remarkable phenomenon that cosmologists have discovered over the past 3 or 4 decades. The laws of nature, when expressed mathematically, contain various constants that have to be tuned to an incredibly fine degree in order for life of any kind to exist. Let me just give you some examples of what this looks like. And by the way, these constants are not determined by the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values for these constants, and physicists are able to describe what the universe would be like if these constants had been altered. And as I say, it turns out that if you alter them at all by the tiniest amount, you can't have the possibility of life in the universe. The gravitational force and electromagnetism have to be tuned within one part in 10 to the 40th power. Otherwise, stars could not form, and thus there would be no solar systems, and thus no planets, and no life. To give you an idea of how large that number is, consider that the number of seconds in the entire history of the universe is only comparatively 10 to the 18th power. The mysterious force known as dark energy has to be tuned to 123 decimal places, which, as MIT cosmologist Max Tegmark recently commented, is extreme enough to be quite embarrassing. Very curious choice of words for a scientist to use. Ask yourself, embarrassing for who and why? Stephen Hawking, who I mentioned earlier, has calculated that the strength of the Big Bang explosion has to be fine-tuned to within 1 part in 10 to the 60th power. Otherwise, the universe would have either expanded so rapidly that galaxies wouldn't have been able to form, or it would have recollapsed on itself. To give you an idea of how big that number is, consider that the number of subatomic particles estimated to exist in the entire universe is 10 to the 80th power. Given the odds that Hawking is talking about just for this one single vector, it would be the equivalent of firing a gun at a 1-inch target 20 billion light years away and hitting it. What's so remarkable about the fine-tuning phenomenon is that all of these constants have to be right. They're independent of each other, and so they all have to be right in order just to get the possibility of life existing in the universe. Now, in addition to these constants, there are also these quantities that function as boundary conditions on the laws of nature, and I'll just share one of these with you, and it's actually the most mind-blowing of all of the fine-tuning phenomenon. The Oxford physicist Roger Penrose, who is Stephen Hawking's colleague, has calculated that the low entropy condition has to be fine-tuned to within 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. Penrose says, "I cannot recall seeing anything else in physics whose accuracy is known to approach, even remotely, a figure like this." The German cosmologist Rüdiger Voss recently wrote an article in which he provides a helpful illustration of just how large this number is. He says this double exponent is unimaginably huge. It has so many zeros that it would, if printed in the format of this book, amount to a stack considerably higher than the diameter of our observable universe. So I hope you can appreciate how someone like the NASA astronomer Robert Jastrow, who had been an atheist for all his life, could say, quote, "Fine-tuning is the most powerful evidence for the existence of God ever to come out of science." In fact, the fine-tuning evidence, together with the evidence for this absolute beginning that I talked about in my first argument, put Robert Jastrow into a terrible quandary that he spoke about quite candidly in the later years of his life. He said he'd been an atheist all his life and hardly even knew how to think about God conceptually, and yet he found this evidence irresistible. So how does the argument for fine-tuning work? Well, it goes like this. First of all, premise one, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise two, it's not due to chance or necessity. As I've already explained, it's not due to necessity because these constants can fall within a wide range. The fact that they don't have to be the way they are is what constitutes the phenomenon of fine-tuning, which is very well established and you can find frequently discussed in the scientific literature. So is it due to chance? Well, the odds of it are effectively zero. You can only salvage the chance hypothesis if you posit the wild idea of a multiverse, a huge number of parallel or sequential universes that exist beyond or alongside of ours. Now, the multiverse faces significant objections, and I'll hold off from presenting them here unless my opponent wants to defend the hypothesis. But absent the multiverse, it's easy to see that design is the most plausible explanation of the fine-tuning phenomenon. My last argument is what's known as the moral argument for God's existence. This is an if-then argument. If you believe in objective moral values and duties, then you ought also to believe in God, because the two stand or fall together. Now, the first premise runs like this. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, I put objective moral in red because I want to define what I mean by those to avoid confusion. And let me just clear up two common misunderstandings of this argument. First of all, this is not an argument that you need God in order to behave morally, nor is it an argument that we need God to inform us about what is right and wrong, say in the Bible or the Quran or the Vedas or something like that. Rather, it's an argument about the nature and the foundation of the basic moral intuitions that we all apprehend in our conscience. So, by moral, I mean something that allows for obligation, praise and blame, and moral indignation, that sense of moral outrage when someone does something that we deem to be really evil. By objective, I mean something that is valid and binding regardless of whether or not anyone believes them to be so. So, for example, if Hitler had won World War II and had succeeded in exterminating or brainwashing everybody who disagreed with him, still the Holocaust would be a moral evil. If you believe that, then you believe in the existence of an objective moral value, something that stands regardless of human opinion. Now, usually with atheists, this first premise is the one I have to argue for. But my opponent tonight, if I understand him correctly, harkens back to a wonderful classical tradition of bold atheists, and he agrees with this premise. And thus, my contention with him will be with the second premise. But just to give you an illustration of how the first part of this argument works, consider Richard Dawkins, the most prominent atheist in the world, saying, "What's to prevent us from saying Hitler wasn't right?" I mean, that is a genuinely difficult question. And that's because on atheism, our moral values, however strongly we might feel them, are simply the biological and sociological spin-off of an evolutionary process that had no mind or purpose or intent behind it. The whole thing is ultimately rooted in mindless matter, which is, of course, impersonal, and because it's impersonal, it's morally indifferent, and therefore cannot serve as any kind of a foundation for objective moral values. Of course, these moral values are helpful in the furtherance and reproduction of our species, but they don't have any ground or anchor, and it's impossible to show that anyone is obligated on an atheistic scheme to conform his or her life to these values. But that leads Here you have one more, as Dawkins concludes, in a Darwinian view of life, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So the second premise of the argument is that objective moral values and duties do exist. And here my claim is just that we immediately apprehend these fundamental moral intuitions in our moral experience, and that we are perfectly justified in believing those to be true unless there is some powerful defeater for those things. And so if Phillip Drum is to overcome this argument, we need to have an argument from him as to why we should eschew our fundamental moral intuitions and believe that they're ultimately illusory. But if he can't do that, then I think the conclusion follows, therefore, God exists. Those are my three arguments, and look forward to hearing what Phillip Drum has to say. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Phillip Drum, and I'm here tonight stating the evidence lies with atheism. But that's not the only reason I'm here. I'm also here to have a debate about what we're going to call evidence in this. It is my contention that all of Dr. Marshall's arguments, as you just saw, were philosophical points. And that's the way he determines what evidence is. But I believe that there's a different way to find out what is actually evidence. I have scientific theorems and scientific data that describe the world in a real way. So it is my contention from the very beginning that philosophy is not good at answering some of the more complicated questions we have in life. But what kind of questions am I talking about? So first I'm going to make a bunch of general claims about philosophy, that they're bad at answering specific types of questions. And then I'm going to show why science can. And then I'm going to go into my argument that uses this kind of evidence. So what kind of questions am I talking about? Well, do we have free will? Does God exist? The topic before us tonight. Is there life after death? What is the best moral system? How did the universe begin? What is knowledge? These questions are very important, and philosophy has been trying to answer them for a very long time. Well, how does philosophy come to truth? We heard truth from the presenter from Ratio Christi from the beginning. Philosophy has been trying to say what truth is for a very long time. But philosophy actually began with the Greeks. Anaximander, Anaxagoras, Thales of Miletus, these men tried to describe what the world consisted of. They came up with very simple answers. Fire, earth, water. And these were the dominant scientific account for a long time. Then came Socrates, who actually changed what philosophy was about in a lot of ways. It's my contention that Socrates switched the problem from what the universe consisted of and what the stars are made of, and made it about human beings and human problems. We talked about morality and those kinds of things. So as I said, how does philosophy come to truth? The definitions have been changing for quite a long time. Socrates was one of the first guys to define it, and he said that truth is that which corresponds to reality. For instance, everyone that's presenting tonight is wearing a gray suit. That sentence would correspond to reality. It was batted around by many years by philosophers, and it was eventually picked up by Kierkegaard, who redefined it and said that truth is something that can be found in mathematics, science, and history. However, it's the only place to find objective truths. And those ideas don't help bring clarity to the self and to subjective experience. So an example of this type of truth would be 1 + 1 = 2. In postmodern philosophy, men like Michel Foucault took up the ideas of Nietzsche and said that truth is just something embodied in the power structures of society. It is something that shifts through time. And a truth statement like that today would be the statement, we live in a democracy. It's a truth that everybody can agree to. But if we actually examine the problem more, truth is very complicated. But you can see why there'd be a problem finding a coherent picture of reality given a system like this. Well, what can philosophy tell you about yourself? My first and most obvious questions were, What can it tell you about these things, these big questions? So what about free will? Well, philosophy's been trying to talk about free will for about 2,500 years, and there are still two camps. There are still two different ideas about what free will is. The compatibilists believe that we have free will so long as we're not constrained. And incompatibilists believe that we do not have free will and there's an illusion. It's more complicated than that, but I'm simplifying 2,500 years of philosophy into a 20-minute talk. What about moral systems? There are two dominant moral systems to this day. From my opinion, there is Kant's categorical imperative, which says always act so that the rule of your action can be willed to be a universal law. This is a type of golden rule. And there's also the utilitarian type of philosophy that describes that we should always act to do the greatest good to the greatest number. There's the famous problem with throwing the switch on the train, if anyone's heard of that. Well, what about the nature of the universe? This concept has been turned over completely to physics. There's not a philosopher in a department in this country that's writing about what stars are made of. This is no longer a topic of debate. Physics has these answers. So like I said, philosophy is not good at answering these types of questions, but I think that science can. It's a discipline that can contrast the natural state of affairs in the universe without invoking any special powers or any special supernatural explanations. Scientists conduct their means of study by observation and experimentation. And more importantly, scientists are fallible and are only as good as the data and the theorems that support that data show them. Well, I asked a question about philosophy, so now I have to ask where science begins. Modern science, without a doubt, begins with physics. Physics describes how atoms are created. It describes how electric charge and how energy is moved throughout reactions. And this can be used by chemistry, this is what I do for a living, chemistry, to describe how chemical reactions happen. Because energy changes in reactions, we can describe how energy flows through reactions, create new reactions, make new drugs. This is what's happening today with all the pharmaceutical companies. This can be used in turn by biologists to explain biological systems, how your kidney works, how sugar gives your body energy, and these sorts of things. How nerves work, how your brain works. Biological systems that go back to chemical concepts, which go back to physical interactions. Well, what can science tell you about yourself? One of the most important things I think science has proven recently is the complete and utter physical nature of the mind. The brain is the biological substrate of the mind. Without the brain, there can be no mind. On this account, dualism, the idea that the mind and the brain are separate things, has been proven false. If you noticed in passing in Dr. Marshall's talk, I kind of got a little giddy and smiled up here when he mentioned disembodied minds, because that's a concept from philosophy from a long time ago. But we know nowadays that there cannot be a mind without a brain. If you lose parts of your brain, like patients with Alzheimer's or patients with Parkinson's disease, then you do not have the ability to have a mind in that sense. It forces us to ask critical questions about our relatives as they get older, if they have these diseases. Because if a relative can't remember me today and he has Alzheimer's, is there something wrong with his soul? Is that part of him not going to heaven? And these critical questions are important in society. What about the universe in which you live? Physics has described every particle that exists. The most fundamental of the two are fermions and bosons. All other particles can be described from this. There are numerous physical theories about how life began. A few years ago, NASA found amino acids, which are the building blocks, the most simple chemicals of life, in comets in 2009. There have also been a lot of other discoveries like that. Evolution is a completely natural explanation of how we evolved slowly from the first chemical components to the complex life we see on Earth today. And it's documented across several different scientific fields. Now on to my actual argument. As I said, I was going to contrast the two systems, philosophy and science. What I think that we have different arguments here tonight. My actual argument is from a book by Richard Carrier called Why I'm Not a Christian, 4 Reasons to Reject the Faith. I actually modified the last argument and changed it to a deist type argument for this debate. The evidence lies with atheism in this debate, which is the title of the debate, because this is not the universe created by a God that was described by Dr. Marshall here tonight. We live in the only type of universe that could have produced the life that evolved on this planet And natural atheism predicts just this type of universe. But it's actually worse for Dr. Marshall than that, because the universe predicted by him, the one that's plausibly personal, with a plausibly personal God, would have features that this universe doesn't actually have. Now I need you to use your imagination and ask yourself this question. If we came to exist in some non-God way, what would the universe look like? I think it's important to realize that because the universe is vastly old, and is vastly massive in scope and scale, that this is a type of universe that could produce life here. This is a photograph of the cosmic microwave background of the universe. This is one of them. This is a picture, I don't know if anybody's ever seen this, of the Hubble Deep Field. It was taken in 1995 by the Hubble Space Telescope. It represents the size of a tennis ball looking into the sky. Every single point on this is a galaxy. As you can tell, the larger ones actually look like galaxies, but even every small point is just a galaxy that's more distant away. Each galaxy is estimated to have 100 billion stars, and and there are approximately 100 billion galaxies in the universe. Life could only have arisen in such a universe like this. If the universe was young, if there wasn't as much matter, if the universe hadn't been experimenting with chemistry for 14 billion years, then there would be evidence for Dr. Marshall's case. But that is not what we see when we look into the night sky. But we have to ask ourselves the former question too. If we came to exist because of a plausibly personal God, what universe would we see? One is my belief that it would be a universe pictured by the early fathers of Christianity, the early fathers of the church. It would be all that was needed for our personal relationship with the plausible deity that is presented here tonight. But that is not the universe that we see. We don't see a small universe or a young universe that existed when humanity was created. I'm not sure about which part of the timeline that science gives that Dr. Marshall denies. That's something that was going to come out in the question and answer session. But humanity evolved approximately 200,000 years ago, according to evolution. If we came to exist in some non-God way, what mechanism could create life? I'm going to say right from the start, it's natural evolution. The planet is proven to be 4 billion years old by multiple different sources. And if it's 4 billion years old, the only thing that could produce life is natural evolution. The idea that a plausibly personal God could produce life doesn't make any sense, because evolution would require billions of years to come from its chemically complex, or from its simple form to its chemically complex form that we see today. What about the opposite question? If we came to exist because of a plausibly personal God, what mechanism could create life? Well, evolution requires billions of years to go from the first replicator, but an infinitely powerful and plausibly personal God would require none of that. If we were the desired object of his creation, why would we be so weak and so frail? This is the world that is shaped by natural atheism. And now we come to my last point. And it's actually one of the more painful ones for me to talk about. Child suffering is one of the most painful things that I've had to witness in this world. When I was on patrol in Iraq, a local police station where the Iraqi police were engaged. And in the skirmish, a little girl was shot. I still remember her father carrying her body because she was shot around, begging for someone to help him. This is one of my most painful memories, but it's something that we must discuss in society. We have to talk about things like this. Gregory Paul, a sociologist from Baltimore, has attempted to quantify the scale of child or human suffering. According to his statistical estimations, because humans evolved approximately 200,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens, there are about 7 billion people living on Earth today. But there are approximately 100 billion humans that have lived since the first humans have evolved. Where medical technology is good, miscarriages and child mortality are a thing of the past, relatively. In America, the NIH estimates miscarriages at about 15 to 20% within the first 7 weeks of pregnancy. The causes of miscarriage are numerous and preventable, which is why most countries like ours have a lower rate. But this is not the world that it used to be. The idea of fertility vitamins, the idea of prenatal care is a new thing. It's something that didn't exist. Well, Paul back calculated the rate of miscarriages since the first of humanity, and estimated that approximately 300 billion natural abortions have happened. That's an astounding number. The world was also a much harsher place for babies. Right now, pretty much every country in Africa has a child mortality rate of about over 100 per 1,000 child. But in America, it's only 5 per 1,000. This is because of medical technology. Children are as fragile as they ever were, but medical technology and the ability to care for them is relatively new. Most of the deaths of children who were actually born were from natural causes such as famine and such as disease and having feeble bodies. The estimation is that half of the population of humanity, 50 billion of the 100 billion humans that have ever been born, died before they reached maturity because of the way the earth is set up, because of the harshness of the environment in which we live. What type of universe could explain such harsh facts about reality? I think the only evidence lies with atheism here. And again, we have to ask ourselves the opposite question. If we came to exist because of a plausibly personal God, what would be the degree and the state of child suffering? I think if there was a plausibly personal God, suggested by Dr. Marshall, then the human reproductive tract would at least be a safe place for unborn children. There wouldn't be a rate so high of miscarriages just in America, where we have the medical technology to prevent a lot of these things. A personal God would see the pain in child suffering and do everything possible to eliminate it from the face of the planet. And a plausibly personal God would at least have more morality than the atheist standing in front of you. Thank you.
Now we come to the portion of our debate known as rebuttal. And in rebuttal, there's an opportunity for each of the debaters to explore what they saw as weaknesses or shortcomings in the other's arguments. And so what you'll see in this next section of 10-minute exchanges and then 5-minute exchanges will be opportunities to probe those areas of weakness and illuminate them further from the position of the debater. And then there'll be also opportunities to repair those arguments that were challenged by the opponent. So we'll see 10-minute rebuttals, and Dr. Marshall will start first, followed by Mr. Drum, and then 5-minute exchanges right after that. Gentlemen?
All right, well, I guess one thing I'd like to say right from the outset is that, as you obviously saw, all of my arguments were not philosophical. I presented a great deal of scientific evidence bearing on the origin of the universe and the incredible fine-tuning of its initial conditions. And I'll await what Mr. Drum has to say to that in the rebuttal phrase. But I suppose the first point that I really need to address myself to is this claim that philosophy is not good at answering the big questions of life, but that this has now properly become the domain of science. Now, this is frankly just an astounding claim to me. Science, by its very definition, is a study of physical relationships, and there are all kinds of things that science simply has no access to because of the kind of discipline that it is. For one thing, logical and mathematical truths science cannot access. It has to assume these, or rather science can't prove them. Science has to assume these things in order to function. There are all kinds of metaphysical beliefs we have, what Alvin Plantinga would call basic beliefs, such as there are other minds other than my own, or the past was not created the world was not created 20 minutes ago with the illusion of a past. Right? These are all things that we're rational to believe, but you can't access them via the scientific method. Ethical beliefs, as I maintained in my moral argument for God's existence, are inaccessible. As Richard Dawkins says, science has no method of determining what is ethical, because the good, all science can do is describe what the effect of certain behaviors will be on human society, but it can't comment on what is the good or the bad of these things. Aesthetic judgments are also inaccessible to the scientific method. Science doesn't have any way of determining what's beautiful and what's ugly. So it just seems to me that however valuable science may be, that it's utterly inadequate to taking the place of philosophy and the other disciplines of the university in solving these questions. Of course, science is tremendously valuable, and it can inform many philosophical questions and our reasonings about things. For example, Philip brought up what science may have to say about the viability of an unembodied or a disembodied mind, and I'll turn to that momentarily. But the whole idea of a university, as John Henry Newman put it in his famous essay by that name in the 19th century, is that you'd have a place where there are all of these disciplines of human knowledge that come together, and each discipline is exposed to the others and understands what the proper functioning and part and role is of its own particular discipline. And as John Henry Newman said, without this, you run into the dreaded man of one idea. That's the man who has his own little department and just sort of shuts out all the rest and tries to cram all of reality within the confines of his little realm. And that's what I think scientism is, besides just being philosophically absurd. I mean, just ask yourself about the statement itself, that science is the only determiner of reality. Well, that's a philosophical statement. That's not a scientific statement. There's no way to verify that scientifically, so that it's self-refuting. So, with regard to the cosmological argument, Philip had a response to my claim that this cause is an unembodied mind, and he says that science has proven the complete physical nature of the mind. How? Because we know that when people experience brain damage, they don't seem to function cognitively in the same way that they did prior to the injury. Well, of course, this is not a deliverance of modern science. Any ancient man who endured warfare would have known that this happened. If you took a hit upside the head with a club in a battle, you probably weren't going to be able to speak or think very clearly afterwards. And yet those people didn't conclude on the basis of that the brain is all there is that the mind is totally physical. So it's not clear to me how this mitigates against the existence of the mind. In fact, I would argue, and this is one of the arguments for theism that's a bit too complicated for me to get into here, but that actually you cannot reduce all of our mental processes, all of our cognitive processes to physical causal things without undermining the reliability of our cognitive faculties themselves. Now, the traditional conception of dualists, that is, people who believe that man is a soul-body union or a mind-body union, is simply that the brain is the instrument of the mind. And so obviously, if the brain is injured, then man, or the person in question being a psychosomatic unit, is not going to be able to function, at least so mentally, at least so far as he is observable to the outside world. But secondly, my argument, if it carries, shows the existence of at least one unembodied mind, namely whatever the cause is of this universe. We saw that in the nature of the case, it has to be immaterial, spaceless, and timeless, and there are only two possibilities as to what that is. So even if you're skeptical about whether human beings have anything, any component, non-material component of their minds, the argument would still show that at least there is one unembodied mind, and that would be the mind that belongs to the cause of this universe, unless you're able to come up with some other candidate that is immaterial, spaceless, and timeless. And I'd welcome Mr. Drum to comment on that. Let me turn in my time that remains to the three arguments for atheism that I understood Mr. Drum to make. The first one, I really don't understand what the argument is, and perhaps he could clarify it in his first rebuttal, which has to do with the size of the universe. I don't understand how the size of the universe is an argument against the existence of God. As anybody who's read the Psalms knows, the size of the universe is rather something that has produced awe in man and made him contemplate his maker. Kant himself recounted as an old man how he never shook off the memory of his mother taking him out and showing him the stars and expressing herself in rapturous admiration of her maker regarding the wonders of the observable universe. So I'd like to hear how this is an argument against the existence of God. Frankly, it would seem that if the universe were very small, that would be an argument against the existence of God, that someone would expect that a great being like God would create something grander than just a tiny little ball-sized world. Mr. Drum's second argument was about the weakness and frailty of man. Again, I don't see how this is an argument against God's existence. First of all, let us not miss the fact that man is the most stunning creature that we know of in all of creation, certainly in the creation that is observable to us. We're the only creatures that are self-conscious in the way that we are, that are capable of rational reflection, capable of creating symphonies and all of the other things that we undertake. I have a quote from Pascal here that talks about the wonder of how God has created us to be both a weak creature and an incredibly exalted creature. He says, man is only a reed, the weakest in nature, but he is a thinking reed. Even if the universe were to crush him, man would still be nobler than his slayer, because he knows that he is dying and the advantage the universe has over him. The universe knows none of this. So I think the way God has made the human race simultaneously stresses both our significance and our insignificance relative to God and the whole great scheme of things. But at any rate, I don't see how this is an argument against God's existence. How do we know that God hasn't created all kinds of other beings? Maybe we're just one being in a whole scale of intelligent life that ranges from the demonic to the most incredibly exalted angelic. So that leaves the last of Mr. Drum's arguments, which is, of course, the problem of evil, the one argument that atheists really have in their arsenal. And my response to this is simply as follows. I think that given the evils that are perpetrated by human beings, the world is as we should expect to find it if a God who is both merciful and just reigns over it. Now, people commonly think about God's mercy and goodness, and that is one side of the coin, but the other side of the coin is God's justice against sin. And I prove this to you as follows. Just ask yourself if you had a choice of eliminating all the natural evil in the world or all the moral evil, which would you choose? That is, you could either eliminate all of earthquakes and tsunamis and diseases but human beings would remain just as they are, or you could turn the world, leave those things, tsunamis and natural disasters and everything, sorry, I'm just out of time, distracted me for a minute. But human beings would be perfected in goodness and love and charity. Now, my argument is that you'd be a fool to not pick the latter option, and that shows that the moral evil in the world is greater than the natural evil. And if human beings are responsible for the greater part of evil and suffering in the world, which is my contention there, then I think there's something odd about us telling God that we won't believe in him on account of all the evil and suffering in the world when we ourselves are causing the greater part of it. Thank you.
Hello again. I'd like to remind everybody while I'm here, I've stated two things: that the evidence lies with atheism because this is the type of natural universe we would expect if there is no God. And secondly, that philosophy cannot answer these complex questions. Now, Dr. Marshall's arguments were philosophical in nature. There were three of them. He did use physical facts about the universe, and he said that those corresponded to his theories. But those aren't facts that are backed up by his theories. Those are just facts that he is lumping into his theories. So first, the Kalam argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe begins to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. So the first problem with this theorem, this idea, this philosophical argument, is something that Sean Carroll recently said in a debate with William Lane Craig. Basically, it's the way that philosophers talked about the universe 2,500 years ago. It's a Socratic way of looking at the universe. Physics no longer talks about transcendental causes. This idea doesn't exist in physics. The idea that there's a transcendental cause that's nowhere in any physics book. begins to exist is actually a complex philosophical statement. If we're pressured to talk about this, I'm sure Dr. Marshall can come up with ideas about it, but it requires you to accept a different theory of time. I bet you didn't know that philosophers had two theories of time. Science really only has one of them. There is the A theory, which states that there is objectivity in the present moment. The A theory of time is required for the Coulomb argument, which is why people who argue this also have to use a different version of physics than Einstein's, because the B theory of time, which says that there is no objectivity of the present, is the physics that works with general relativity and that works with quantum theory. So again, if we accept the Coulomb, we have to accept faulty physics. The universe begins to exist, well, except for quantum mechanics. Dr. Marshall mentioned the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. His interpretation of the theorem is that the Big Bang model of the universe must have a beginning. That's not what the actual theorem says. It says that the Newtonian way to describe the universe, the way using Newtonian physics, breaks down at the beginning of time. That doesn't mean that there's a beginning. There's actually a lot of theories that go into this. So it's a logical claim as well, that something can't come from nothing, that something can't pop into nothing, but physics says this is incorrect. Again, we also have a problem with definitions. Philosophers define nothing in a different way than scientists do. They define it as the absence of anything, which I think we both can agree, Dr. Marshall and myself, doesn't exist anywhere in the world, in the universe, anywhere. The absence of anything, the complete idea of nothingness, is just a concept of philosophy, a straw man thrown up. Scientists calls nothingness the quantum vacuum, and it describes how the universe could have arisen from such a quantum state. There are alternate theories that go along with this. Endless Universe is a book by Steingarten and Turok that was written in 2011. It talks about how there's problems with the Big Bang cosmology. Again, Dr. Marshall said that there is the Big Bang and that's it. That is completely false. Science doesn't work like that. There are several different theories. One that says that there's an endless universe. There's one theory about cyclic universes. There's models using quantum fluctuations. This is a quantum fluctuation from a paper at Harvard. This describes how atoms are popping in and out of reality all the time. The virtual particles are popping in and out of reality all the time. This won the Nobel Prize, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago. This is how Lawrence Krauss believes the universe came into existence, from a quantum vacuum, nothingness type state like this. Therefore, the classic question, if the universe is caused by God, what caused God? The fine-tuning argument, fine-tuning of the universe is due to chance, necessity, or design. It's not due to chance or necessity, therefore it is due to design. If you change the laws of physics in our local conditions, it is true that life probably wouldn't work. But before Dr. Marshall can say that life wouldn't work under any conditions, I think he has to describe to me what life is. And again, science has varying definitions of this. If it's just information being transmitted between generations, there's several different ways to get around life. He also has to tell me on what conditions life can currently exist, because again, science doesn't know that either. We don't know if life can exist on other planets. We originally believed that life couldn't exist under the ocean, near volcanic vents, but now some scientists believe that's where life started. And the final argument... Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I wanted to talk about multiverses as well. There are very probable natural explanations to fine-tuning as well. The first bruising was discovered in the cosmic microwave background in 2010, about 4 years ago. This bruising is believed to be other universes in contact with our own. So this is the first evidence of a multiverse. Multiverses could provide the answer to fine-tuning, because if there's several universes, all of them could have different constants. And physics describes several theories where when a universe would be created, we don't really have a natural theory of this yet, but they describe different theories about what could happen, that the basic quantum numbers, the basic things, would all be changed and would all be broken with symmetry with each other, because symmetry is ubiquitous throughout the universe. Therefore, it is due to design. And then the last argument I have, or that Dr. Marshall had, was the moral argument. If God does not exist, objective morals and values do not exist. Objective moral and values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. To be honest, this is an argument from, again, the totalitarian past of philosophy. This is when philosophers believed that we could assign moral values that would be for every single culture. This no longer exists. These ideas don't happen like that anymore. The problem was touched on with morality by Kant and his categorical imperative, like I said. Nietzsche actually analyzed morals and described how morality had changed from the Greek civilization to the civilization of current Christianity. That's why Nietzsche is so hated by Christians. Oops. The idea of philosophy is very beautiful and thought-provoking, but it can't come up with these kind of answers, as I said. There are complex and very concrete sociobiological explanations of why we all follow the golden rule, why we don't murder our grandmothers, as Christians usually say to atheists, and why we all love our children. Dr. Marshall's trying to come up with theories about why this happens, but I state in here that everybody is programmed with these kind of general feelings, that we all have a core morality that is programmed in our genes. This is again proven by sociobiologists. This is shown by several different methods of evidence. There have been fMRI scans. You know how Dr. Marshall said that we can't prove the physical nature of the mind? Well, I said it could be proved across several different scientific disciplines. He mentioned one of them, the idea from brain damage, because I said Alzheimer's patients, Parkinson's disease, and so forth. But there's also several other ways. fMRI machines are machines that can actually functionally measure the brain waves in your brain as they are actively putting information out. This, again, proves the complete physical nature of the mind. Scientists can actually predict decisions about patients before they know what they're going to do. The physical nature of the mind is completely proven. Living in a community with these basic rules, this core morality, it helped our species evolve and take over the planet as we currently have. If we didn't have these basic rules, if we were always killing each other in society, then we would not survive. And I posit that anyone here tonight could just go and kill the guy next to him randomly. It is not programmed in you. And it did not come from God. It did not come from anything besides the evolution of your body needing to get along with other human beings. I would also point to the vast history of sexuality across several different cultures to just compound the idea that there's any such thing as moral duties in any real sense. All societies have vastly different gender roles, vastly different sexual expectations, and extremely different ways to project what they would call sexuality. This idea that moral duties exist kind of gets broken down when you explore the sexual practices of societies and view it from a sociological perspective. Thank you.
All right, well, let me review some of these objections to the arguments that I offered. First, with regard to the Kalam cosmological argument, Phillip says that physics no longer talks about transcendental causes. I don't see how that's to the point, whether physics talks about transcendental causes or not. First of all, wouldn't expect physics to do that as physicists, because that's not the domain of physics, that's the domain of philosophy. But the actual truth of the matter is that physicists do talk about transcendental causes. I gave you an example about Stephen Hawking's birthday party when he's trying to find a model that averts this absolute beginning. And he gives you as his example that if we don't have an eternal past history to the universe, then we're going to have to appeal to a transcendental cause, which he says he doesn't want to do. Secondly, Phillip says that the Kalam is based on an A theory of time. That's true. He says that, however, good science, Einstein's theory of general relativity, is based on a B theory. Now, I don't want to get too complicated with you, but let me just explain to you very briefly the difference between an A theory and a B theory of time. The A theory of time simply holds that temporal becoming is real, that there's a real difference between present, past, and future. The B theory of time says that temporal becoming is illusory and that the future exists right now just as really as the past or the present does. And general relativity does not at all revolve around the B theory of time. In fact, it revolves, if anything, around the A theory of time. And there are lots of good reasons to staying with the A theory. It's our common sense view of time. As D.H. Miller, a philosopher, says, tense is so striking an aspect of reality that only the most compelling argument justifies our denying it. And I don't see any good argument like that for a B theory of time unless we're trying to avert this absolute beginning to the universe. So what about the scientific evidence I gave for that second premise of the cosmological argument? The universe began to exist. Well, here Mr. Drum says that the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem that I talked about just means that the Newtonian theory of gravity breaks down at the beginning of the universe. This is not the case at all. I will quote to you from Vilenkin himself. He says, the remarkable thing about this theorem is its sweeping generality. We did not even assume that gravity is described by Einstein's equation. So even if Einstein's gravity requires some modification, our conclusion will still hold. And I quoted to you Vilenkin's stunning statement, there is no escape, cosmologists have to face the problem of an absolute beginning. So if all the theorem meant is that the theory of gravity breaks down when we get back to the beginning, which every cosmologist has known for decades, there's nothing remarkable about that, then there'd be no need for these statements about an absolute beginning. There'd certainly be no need for Stephen Hawking's fear about the implausibility of past eternal models of the cosmos. Mr. Drum appeals to Lawrence Krauss, who I mentioned earlier, saying that science has taught us that nothing is simply the quantum vacuum. I can't think of any academic in recent history who has so ruthlessly abused the English language as Lawrence Krauss has done. Lawrence Krauss knows very well that the quantum vacuum is not nothing. It's a roiling sea of physical energy. He also knows that the quantum vacuum cannot be past eternal. That's what the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem is all about, and that's why Krauss himself was compelled to concede, I agree, all the evidence says the universe had a beginning. So why does Lawrence Krauss want to redefine nothing as the quantum vacuum? Because he doesn't want to deal with the question of what's on the other side of that, which is real nothing, non-being. And so he just wants to substitute the quantum vacuum in its place for the same reason that Stephen Hawking doesn't want a universe that has an absolute beginning either, because of its clear theistic implications. And finally, Mr. Drum says that there are these other eternal cosmologies that are eternal in the past. This is simply not the case. Even Roger Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmology, which Phillip alluded to, is not past eternal. Roger Penrose himself, when asked about that, says, I'm not addressing that question. That's the next question, and I'm not saying this happens. So I don't see that there's any plausible cosmological model on offer that will restore a past eternal universe. And it's certainly indisputable that the scientific consensus all points in the direction of the universe having an absolute beginning. I guess that's it, right?
So I'd like to ask about the domain of philosophy. In the beginning, Dr. Marshall said that certain questions are not in the domain of science. There have been several books written, again, about morality by scientists who study the mind and by scientists who study all of these things. Also, I'd like you to realize that Dr. Marshall's contention about Einstein's physics and about relativity is, again, false. One of the central premises for anyone that has ever studied relativity, and I have when I took physics in college, is spontaneity. This concept that two observers can see something at one time. This is disproven by the A theory of time, says this kind of thing could not happen. Okay? The B theory of time is what describes Einstein's theory of relativity. I'd also like to read from you, a moral dilemma from a book. This is just something to think about. This is kind of just something I wanted to do if I had extra time to talk about before we got into the question and answer session. So this is from a book called The Magus by John Fowles. So during World War II, the mayor of a small Greek village being occupied by the Nazis had some resistance fighters. The resistance fighters shot some of the Nazis down by the beach. There were 3 of them, and they shot 3 Nazis. To retaliate, the Nazis captured the resistance fighters and put them on posts in the town. You know, symbolically, these are the men that attacked us and so forth. Then Then they also put 1,000 women and children into the city square and brought out the mayor. And they said, "Mayor, these men have done things against us, and if you don't want us to kill these 1,000 women and children, you're going to have to shoot these men." Now, I have to ask you, if you're in the mayor's situation, think about what you would have done. Well, it turns out the Nazis are actually playing a trick on them because, you know, Nazis are pretty evil. When he picks up the rifle and takes aim, they've actually given him an unloaded gun. So he says, these men have still done what they needed to do. They still sinned against us, against the Nazis. You have to kill them, right? So he goes up, he raises the butt of the rifle to strike the first man and beat him to death. And the guy yells the word for freedom in Greek. And he drops the rifle, and he can't beat the guy to death. So the Nazis shoot all 3 guys on the post and all 1,000 people in the square. The point of this whole idea, of this whole story, is that for embodied context, for reasons beyond your control, you just might not be able to club a man to death on the day that you wake up. And it might not be something that you have in your power. And that these moral situations like this really embody the morality we have in real life when choices are difficult to make and we don't really see an answer in sight. Thank you.
All righty, each up to this point, each person has been able to present their arguments uninterrupted, and you've been able to sort of weigh the pros and cons of each argument as it's been presented. At this point in the debate, they are going to get to directly engage each other. And so for the next 10 minutes, Marshall gets to cross-examine Drum. So Marshall gets to ask the questions, and Drum must provide the answers. And then, of course, the tables will turn, and Drum will be able to ask Marshall the questions, and Marshall must respond. So this is a challenge because neither candidate is allowed to answer a question with a question, which when I get stumped, that's what my preferred strategy is, but that will be off the table for the next 10 minutes. So gentlemen, enjoy answering one another's questions.
All right, everybody here okay? Get this a little closer. Well, I guess, Philip, for starters, I'd like to give you a little bit of chance to interact with the philosophical evidence that I adduced in favor of the kalam. We can bracket for a moment the stuff we've gone back and forth from regarding the scientific evidence. But how would you answer those arguments that result if you get an infinite number of things existing? Like if the number of events in the history of the universe is infinite?
Well, I think that's sort of a straw man argument because I think most physicists and even most people would, even yourself, would admit that there's no such thing as an actual infinity in the universe. So it's kind of throwing a concept from mathematics out there and saying, since this doesn't exist, therefore God exists. And that doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, so you would maintain that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite?
I think, again, physics doesn't know that answer, and I don't know that answer. I mean, there's still multiple theories with different data trying to figure out this.
Well,
different
right,
theories.
But if the universe is past eternal, it would follow logically that the number of events in the history of the universe is infinite, correct?
I would suppose. Again, there's cyclical universe theories. There are other theories. You can continue asking the question like different ways, but I don't really know. I don't have an answer for you because science hasn't come to a consensus yet.
Okay. So the universe, you would think, may be past eternal and may not?
It could be.
Okay. And let's say if the universe is not past eternal, how would you account for its origin?
Well, there are many different theories. As I said, the multiverse accounts for its origins fairly well. There's no naturalistic theory that we have of universe generation, but Most of physics either believes it's eternal, past eternal, cyclic, or it came from a quantum fluctuation. And even the Gordon-Blinken paper that you cited said at the end of the paper that it came about because of a quantum fluctuation, that's how the universe came about.
Well, I would disagree with that, but we'll say that for the question and answer, the closing statements maybe. But I guess my question to you is, if it were to turn out to be the case that the scientific evidence converged, where I believe it already has converged, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it does, right? That scientists conclude that the universe, or multiverse, as Vilenkin says, does have an absolute beginning, that what Vilenkin says is true, that it's no longer, that cosmologists have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. So if that were to be the case, how would you account for that? Would you rather believe that the universe has some transcendent cause, or that it sprang into existence uncaused out of nothing?
Probably uncaused out of nothing. I mean, I can't see anything transcendent, any other transcendent causes. As I said, physics doesn't really talk about that anymore, except as opposed to what their theories give. Naturalistic explanations are one thing, and you said that Hawking didn't want to give a transcendental cause because it's not a naturalistic explanation, you know?
So would you think that physics is capable of giving an explanation of how being can arise from non-being?
I think that it can give an explanation of how consciousness arises. I'm not sure what that term being means. You know, that's one of those mucky philosophical terms that we'd have to really get into. I've read a lot of definitions, but you know.
Well, let me just put it another way then. Let's just suppose that the material universe, matter, energy, space, and time, do in fact come into existence at a definite point in the finite past, and that physicists decide that on the other side of that is nothing, not the quantum vacuum, but simply non-being.
Okay.
All right, if that were the case, do you think that there could be a physical account of how being arises from non-being?
I would say no, because there's nothing physical. You said there was nothing, so there cannot be a physical count.
Okay.
If you've created the situation where there's a real nothingness that, again, doesn't exist anywhere in the universe.
So wouldn't it follow then that physics is impotent at that point to render a judgment on which is more plausible, the universe springing into existence out of nothing whatsoever like sheer magic, or it having emanated from a transcendent cause? Wouldn't that be a question that physics could no longer speak to at that point?
I would say that physics cannot answer that question now, but I would say wait, you know, like the Hubble Space Telescope is a pretty recent invention. The idea that we can see these galaxies is fairly new. The amount of the size of the universe is a relatively recent understanding.
But I thought you just conceded that physics could not, just by definition, give an account of being arising from non-being, simply because there can be no physics of non-being.
I was saying that physics can't do it now, but I don't know what physics can do in the future. I don't know what particles or ideas or ingenious theorems will be thought up tomorrow, you know?
Okay, okay. All right, well, let me move on to something else. Let me turn to the moral argument for God's existence that I gave. You talked a lot in your first rebuttal there about the origin of our moral values, the biological and sociological origin of our moral values. I'm interested to know how, even if that is the case, how our moral values originated, that invalidates them. I mean, wouldn't that commit the genetic fallacy, which says that just because you can show how something arose, that therefore the belief itself is false? Your argument seemed to be, if I understood it correctly, that because we know that our moral values evolve through this sociological, biological process that is behind us, therefore we know that they don't have any objective status.
I would say that that's a very complicated question, but that in general, I would say that they are the right moral values. The core morality is the right kind of core morality if you want to build a society that you need. But if you don't want to build a society, if we're not trying to do that, then we don't need that core morality. And that it's not anything that's written in the laws of the universe. It's just written in our genetic code.
So is there any moral action, whatever, about which you would be prepared to say that it's categorically evil? Like, say, someone raping and torturing a little child for fun?
Yes, I would definitely say that that's categorically and morally evil because of my cultural training, because of my genetics, because of my biology. I believe and I feel pain when I see children feel pain.
Okay, so what you mean is that you're biologically conditioned to affirm this, but that intellectually in your mind you know that that conviction doesn't have any real ontological status?
Yes, but that doesn't stop me from feeling it. I mean, I can have a meta belief, a belief about my belief that is that still lets me hold those beliefs. Like I can hold an idea very valuable in my head, like I can hold it and believe it, but I can still know that that idea could be wrong, that I am fallible, that I can make mistakes.
Okay, so you admit then this conflict between your meta theory, if you will, what you really believe is true about reality, and what you find yourself sort of inescapably feeling in your heart and your soul, metaphorically, of course, as you're concerned, about good and evil, correct?
I wouldn't say it in those terms, but yeah. My brain, my mind.
And so is your justification for this then that there is no God? And since there is no God, we know that these objective moral values are illusory. Is that how the argument works?
No, the argument would work that these objective moral values are illusory because, or not real, or that moral nihilism would be correct, simply because they could have been other values and we would have known, like, they're just values that evolved out of us. We had no choice in their evolution, you know, in our whole deterministic way. We had no choice in what values that we value, you know?
Okay, but even if that were the case, as I was mentioning, don't you see how that commits the genetic fallacy, which is sort of a basic thing you learn in logic? That is to say, let's suppose that you were a Republican, and I could show that the reason you have these beliefs about Republicanism is because you were raised in a Republican household and surrounded by Republicans and watched the Fox News channel all the time and never got to tune into CNBC or CNN. Right? That might, and let's say I were correct, and that really was the reason why you were a Republican. That wouldn't go to show, it seems to me, that Republicanism is therefore a false political philosophy. And it just seems to me that that's the nature of your argument about moral values, that because we know that they arose within us in this certain manner, that therefore they don't have any objective status. But wouldn't that have to assume that there's no transcendent cause of the universe?
I would say that because objective moral values do not exist in the way that, I mean, like I said, I don't think that they exist in the way you think they do, in the way that you think that they exist. I feel them because of my cultural training, but I have ideas because I've read other things about what morals are and how morals evolved and how morals have changed throughout time. And I know that if I was living when I was a Greek, I would have valued things very differently. I would have treated women differently. I would have had a whole other concept of what it meant to be moral. So since these things shift through time, but we still have a certain core morality, you see what I'm saying?
Well, yes, I do, but my argument is precisely about the core morality. And so you do concede that there is some kind of core morality that transcends cultures?
I would say that there is a core morality that Homo sapiens have, but not a core morality of the universe. Again, because it's socio-biological. It's not something that's written into the laws of the universe.
Okay. And so just to understand you correctly then, your argument is that notwithstanding this, okay, I'm out of time, you're up. All right.
I just wondered to begin with, which parts of the naturalistic timeline given by science do you doubt? Evolution, or do you doubt other theories?
None. I don't see any significant reason to doubt that the universe is 13.7, 13.8, according to the latest estimate, billion years old. And I believe in the antiquity of the Earth as well. I don't have any issues with that.
What about human evolution, the evolution of animals?
Yeah, well, there on the question of the evolution of the human race, I think that the evidence for the Darwinistic explanation of their development is quite ambivalent. I'm open to it if that's where the evidence leads, but I think that it's a pure propaganda claim of the Darwinists to say that they have sealed their case. Ever since the discovery of DNA by Watson and Crick in the 1950s, it has become increasingly difficult for Darwinism to account for not only the origin of life itself, but for the development of life within the comparatively short time that... Okay, sorry. Go on.
That's all right. That's just... I'm just going to say that's simply false. Evolution is proved across several different modes of thought. You spoke of moral values, and I said in my speech about moral values, my little talk about it, that I wondered if they included sexual values, the sexual values that certain cultures hold.
Yes, yes, some of those core moral values would include sexual values.
Can you give me an example of a core moral sexual value?
Yes, like for a father to rape his 3-year-old daughter. I don't think you can show me any culture anywhere that thinks that that's acceptable.
Okay. What about how you treat your wife? What about those kinds of ideas, or if you have a wife to begin with?
Yeah, well, clearly that doesn't constitute part of our core moral values, as we all know, in terms of the historical development of human morals.
Okay. What about homosexuality? Is there a moral reason to believe that we shouldn't be homosexual?
Sorry, are you asking me if I think that the conviction that homosexuality is wrong is a sort of one of these universal historical human beliefs?
No, I'm asking if you think that there is a moral reason, a moral law, if you believe that there are moral duties, is one of the moral duties to have sex and propagate the species, or can we have sex with who we want to?
No, I don't think we can have sex with who we want to. I think
Okay.
that homosexuality is something that falls under the things that are objectively evil.
Okay.
But how is that relevant to my moral argument?
Because there are several cultures that actually go against these ideas. There's a culture of Native Americans who used to live here in America. They had a gender role, a third gender called the Berdach. You'd go out in the nature, you'd have a rite of passage, and then you'd come back and you could be a different gender. This is how it was done for thousands and thousands of years. Men would come back and be women. Women would come back and be men. And this was something that was regular. The idea of homosexuality doesn't exist in a culture like this, which is why if you say it's a moral duty, then you're going to have to explain some other cultures, because there's a lot of these cultures that are like this.
Okay, well, my argument that any particular thing is a moral duty is not based on the fact that it's universally held. Now, the argument that I put forward tonight is based on there being a core morality. Actually, all the argument requires is that someone or some culture believe that at least one thing is objectively evil. But none of us would believe that the only way something that can be evil is if every culture in the history of the human race had believed that it were okay. I mean, on those grounds, you couldn't even show that child sacrifice is illegal, is immoral. Which would be absurd, obviously.
Yes, I agree completely.
So,
it is absurd.
But that invalidates the line of reasoning you were just pursuing.
I don't think it does, but we'll go on to something else.
Okay.
Do you think that abstract ideas can be expressed in any other way besides analogy and metaphor?
I'm not sure. I'm not even sure I understand what that question means.
It's just about the abstract ideas we're talking about tonight. Do you think there's any other way to express them besides analogy and metaphor? Those two literary devices.
I would think mathematics is also capable of expressing them.
Okay. This is a personal question. If you do not want to answer it, you do not have to. One day, your son is going to grow up. If you had to make a choice about his future, would you rather he become an atheist or a drug addict? They're both horrible, I know, from your opinion, but...
Is he going to be permanently one or the other?
I would say that depending on the story. I would say yes. You have to make a choice, and he has to be one or the other.
Okay, if he's going to be permanently one or the other, I'd rather him be a drug addict than an atheist.
Okay. Thank you. I guess you mentioned DNA. Do you trust DNA tests?
I don't see any reason to distrust them. It's not my field of study.
The same test that can prove that you have an offspring is the same test that's used by evolutionary biologists to prove that we're related to other species, to prove these types of things, that DNA is related.
Well, what you mean is that there's a tremendous similarity between our DNA and the DNA of other species, but it doesn't follow from that that we're all connected by development one to another. Now, I don't deny that to be the case. I'm just saying it's simply a non sequitur to say that simply because there's similarity, that therefore there's a development relationship.
I think that the fact that we do not have a special genetic code, the fact that our genetic code is the same as the flower, that they have the same things, but they're just rearranged slightly, is proof that there is no, like, that is proof that there is no creator, because we have no special DNA. There's no special mechanism with which we propagate the earth. We produce by sex like every other creature. We do these things. We exchange DNA like every other creature.
Well, it just seems to me that all that would show is that if there's a God, that God has created the universe with a connection to itself, that there is a pattern, that there is an artistry to it. I don't see why, in order to believe that God has created things, that he has to make everything so genetically different. Maybe God wants to underscore a certain commonality. But even if the evolutionary paradigm is completely true, and I'm not here to argue against that, even if it's true that all life descends from a common ancestor, and I did a PhD in the history of science, I know very well the difficulties that Darwinists have in maintaining that. I'll just quote you from Harvard scientist Leslie Valiant. This is a book that just came out a couple of months ago. He says, if all the mutations that drive evolution were simply random, which is the Darwinistic mechanism, it would proceed at an impossibly slow and inefficient pace. David Depew and Bruce Weber in a recent article in Biological Theory, Darwinism in its current scientific formulation has pretty much reached the end of its rope. Edward Frankel, professor at Cal Berkeley, reviewed Leslie Valiant's book in the New York Times a couple of months ago and praised it highly. Listen to what he says in conclusion. This is science at its best, driven not by dogma and blind belief, but by the desire to understand, intellectual integrity, and reliance on facts. Now, I don't think you're going to accuse people at Cal Berkeley and Harvard and authors in the journal Biological Theory of sticking their head in the sand. They're pointing out the real difficulties that Darwinism has. But as I say, even granting that Darwinism is true and that everything descends in this way from some...
To use a naturalistic system such as evolution to create us. Let's see. Do you believe there is such a thing as the right interpretation of any part of literature, not including your own?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I think that's all the questions I have.
Thank you, gentlemen. And now we are going to have some time for Q&A from the audience. And here's how it's going to work. We have one microphone, and I believe it's either been picked up. Where's our mic person? There he is. You can see him. He's big and bright. He's got his teal on. Go Seahawks. Nice. Thank you. Here's how it's going to work. If you have a question for Dr. Marshall, please proceed to your left up the stairs or off to the hallway on the side. Don't bump the cameras, please. If you have a question for Mr. Drum, please proceed to your right and gather on this side. What we will have this young gentleman do is he will walk back and forth. We will take one question from each side so that the questions are balanced and so that we can continue our discussion in this back and forth manner. So if you've got a question, if you would rise and proceed to sort of forming a rough line, we will get started as soon as we're ready. While folks are forming their line, let me give you a couple of other rules. The rules are, those who have questions have 30 seconds to state your question. Do not use this time for a speech. While you may be precious in the eyes of God, or not, please understand that the primary goal tonight is to hear from our speakers and not from those with questions. Okay, the speaker to whom the question is addressed will have 2 minutes to respond. The other speaker will have 1 minute to give a counter response. I'll be polite in keeping time limits for everybody involved so that we can hear as many questions as possible. Let's begin with a question this is for Phillip.
Hey, Mr. Phillip, I just want to ask you, when it came to you being, I just have a lot of friends that serve in the military, and like, I just want to personally ask you, like, when it comes to what you saw, how could you come from where you came from and then come back and not be a Christian? Like, I just don't get that, because like, sometimes things like that would break people, and they fall on God. I'm just saying.
Man, I don't even know how to answer that question. You know, I don't even know where to start. I'm not that type of person. I would never call upon a higher power if I was, you know, on the verge of death, as I have been more than once. I just don't know. People just are wired differently. Maybe from your, you know, experience. Anybody has to call on God, but there are several different people in the world, and some people just don't believe that, man.
I think I'll pass on that question. I'm not sure how to comment on it.
Hello? 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 There it is.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you both for being here. I really appreciate it. My question, of course, is for Dr. Marshall, because I'm in this line. Let's see how that goes. We literally had to pick sides tonight. I see how that goes. Okay. You mentioned earlier, you asked us to do a kind of like a thought experiment in regard to morality, and you asked us to pick if we would rather eliminate all of the evil caused by man or all of the evil caused by natural disasters and nature.
Right.
Am I quoting you correctly?
Yes, that's correct. The natural evil, the moral evil.
Okay. Based on the discussion that we've observed tonight, I would contend that the way we understand morality has in some way to do with the evolution of the human brain. Would you agree to that? That the way we interpret what morality is has to do with the evolution of the human body and the evolution that has taken place since, as you contend, the Big Bang happened?
I think that may or may not be the case.
Okay.
But let's assume for the sake of your question that it is the case.
We need only one more question from you because we got to hear from lots of other folks. So what is your final question?
My question is that, I guess that was my question in a way, is because
Awesome.
I see no difference in the natural disasters that are caused by natural occurrences on Earth and the moral wrongs that are done by people who evolved by the same processes as that Earth. If you'd like to
thank you. Thank you. Quick.
Come to the Carolina Ale House. I'll be happy to hash that out with you.
Yes. Awesome. Did you have a comment? You have an opportunity to comment on that question? Good to go. Next question.
I actually wanted to ask both, but since I could only ask one, both of you agreed that child sacrifice was an evil in this world. So would you not believe that abortion is an evil in this world?
That's to me.
That's to you first. You get 2 minutes and then 1 minute.
I didn't realize this was going to be a political debate, but I've done those as well. I think abortion is a very political and one of the most politically charged topics in this country. Unless I've been under a rock for the past 10 years of my life, it is extremely political. I believe that, first of all, that a woman should have the right to choice over the rights of something unborn, that a woman has actual rights. I believe that abortion could be considered wrong, but again, if we're going to consider abortion wrong, you're going to have to address the point that I said. Since the first Homo sapiens, approximately 300 billion natural abortions have happened. If God is naturally aborting, if your God is naturally aborting babies, you're going to have to explain to me how that's moral and how a moral agent can do such a thing. The rate of miscarriage in America, according to the National Institute of Health, is still 15 to 20%, and it's higher in countries without these kind of medical technologies. If abortion is evil, then God is the greatest killer of us all. Thank you.
1 minute to respond.
Sure. Well, I think on atheism, abortion, as well as child sacrifice for that matter, as I argued tonight, would not be immoral, because nothing is immoral. And Phillip Drum himself contends that there are really no objective moral values. So I think on atheism, obviously abortion is permissible, and there are no grounds for saying that a woman should have a right to do what she wants to do with her own body. There's no ground for any kind of rights like that on an atheistic scheme. Now, on a theistic scheme, the answer to that question would all revolve around what is the status of that life in the mother's womb. And if the status of that life is human, then the life is protected and ought to be afforded the same intrinsic dignity that we assign to all human life.
Next question.
Dr. Marshall, is that on?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm surprised that what to me is the obvious question in this debate has not yet been directly addressed. And that is, if you have something something coming to be into existence. You said a beginning, something coming into existence. There has to be a cause. What is the cause of God existing?
Yes, that's a very common question. So who caused God? And let me just say two things about that. First of all, even if you didn't know what the cause of the universe is, it doesn't invalidate the argument that the universe has a cause. In order to accept an explanation as the best, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. Otherwise, we can never explain anything at all, because for any explanation that anyone could give, you could always say, well, what is its explanation?
That was one of
and
your
what is its
reasons.
explanation? And what is its explanation? So even if you don't know who or what caused the cause of the universe, you should still, if you embrace the logic of the argument, say, I agree, the universe has a transcendent cause. But if God does exist, it doesn't make any sense to ask what caused God, because God is by definition an uncaused being. I mean, if God, or if God, what you call God, had a cause behind it, then that cause would be God and not God himself. So God may or may not exist, but if God does, it makes as much sense to ask what caused him as it does to ask a bachelor an unmarried bachelor what the name of his wife is.
How can that be your reason for what
All right,
you ask what causes the universe?
Mr. Drum has a chance to respond.
Come to Carolina Ale House, we'll hash it out. All of you atheists are quite invited.
And you know we drink.
That was a brilliant. Yeah, we need not go any further.
Sometimes. I would just say that these kind of philosophical arguments, as I tried to point out, aren't really arguments at all. They're very linguistic in nature, and they can't point to the types of things that we see. The Kalam cosmological argument is just an argument that's based on language about certain things that philosophers no longer talk about. They don't talk about the causes of the universe anymore. That's something that philosophers talk about. That whole domain has been turned over to physics completely.
Thank you. Next question.
Hey, I'm good with you being an atheist and whatever. My question is, and it kind of goes with what the other ones were saying a little bit, but science is kind of what we have observed in the past, and then going forward, and just that you can duplicate it. How do you get around, and this is to Phillip, how do you get around life that we've never seen life come from non-life? Not once. And you can have I mean, it comes down to faith on either side, which because we weren't there for the beginning of evolution, we weren't there when God created us. So how do you get around that as an atheist and say, how do we get life? We've never duplicated it. I can't get life from the rock or this banister or anything else. They've only come from other life of similar life. Never, not once. And that's, I guess, where I'm wondering, how do you square that with your philosophy or your beliefs?
Okay, well, thank you. I would say that I would use scientific theories to talk about that kind of thing. They talked about, there's been scientific theories about how the first chemicals created some sort of evolutionary advantage, then the first replicators, and then cells and so forth. These have been proven. The Miller-Urey experiments are something people can look up. Those were the first experiments done to prove that the early Earth atmosphere could create the chemicals, the amino acids, that were necessary for life. So there are answers in science that can explain how life began, because it creates a slight advantage over what it would have had if it didn't have this advantage to replicate, to chemically replicate. And evolution, the theory of evolution, explains this.
Well, I would just say there is no, right now, viable theory as to how life originated from non-life. Now, obviously, biologists are working on that and trying to come up with such a theory, but there is no such compelling theory. And all that we've discovered about DNA and what actually is in the cell, what is involved in life on this planet, has only made the problem much more pressing for Darwinists. But, as I argued tonight, the evidence for fine-tuning is so overwhelming that the theist today can afford to grant the atheist everything he wants with Darwinism. He can just say, okay, I give you that. I grant you for the sake of argument that your naturalistic process can explain the origin of life and the entire subsequent development of planetary life here on Earth. Still, the odds of that are overwhelmingly more probable than the odds of getting even a life-permitting universe to begin with.
Thank you. Next question.
This is, oh wow, okay. This is just out of curiosity, since both of you guys are really, really good at answering questions. You talked today the entire time about the beginning of existence, and I was wondering, what happens at the end, heaven, hell, or if anything, if it just goes on for infinitum, which I think in both instances, as far as I know, both sides say that it goes on for infinitum, but it has a beginning. Where does the evidence lie in that factor? And just for my curiosity, because you guys are both really, really smart, and I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, the scientific evidence is that the universe is going to end in what's called a heat death. That is, it's gradually going to dissipate and things will drift further and further away from each other until ultimately there's just a very, as it were, smooth, dark, infinitely long or approaching infinitely long isolation. So it's a quite bleak picture of the universe, and that one has on the contemporary physics, given atheism. Of course, theism is not committed to that because God is free to intervene at any time that he wants and remake his creation. And obviously, different types of theisms would have different ideas about how, if, and when God would do that.
Dr. Marshall is right. The most physical theories tell us that the universe will end in heat death. The entire universe will eventually spread out, all the galaxies spreading out from each other, and will eventually reach a temperature of about 3 Kelvin. At this temperature, no life can function. In one of the books that I've read to prepare for this debate, it's called The Atheist's Guide to Reality by Alex Rosenberg. He says, since physics fixes all the facts, that there could be no moral law because the universe actually ends in a heat death. That's one of his ideas. So because there's a heat death, that no moral action we add infinitely really matters, that there's no moral action here, there's no action that matters because the universe ends like that.
All right, thank you both.
Yeah, no problem.
Next question.
First, I'd like to thank you for coming out tonight without you having the courage to come out and facing the firing squad, if you will. You won't be able to have this discussion tonight.
Which one are you talking to?
Yeah. Well, right. And I also apologize personally for running out on you. Nature called, and I held out as long as I could. Listen to the debate tonight. I had a list of questions. I haven't pulled out my book, but I'm not allowed to use that. And I've come to realize, as the old adage says, the devil's in the details. So I'm going to just ask you the question that I intended before I came here today. We know what purpose it serves, what good it does, if you will. That has been proven by secular scientists, psychology, sociology, and so on. There's been nuns that have given their brains for the betterment of mankind as far as Alzheimer's and so on. My question to you is, what good do atheist organizations that seek to undermine religion do? And let me give an example.
Wait a minute, what's the question? The question is, what good do atheist organizations do?
Right, these kinds that attack religion publicly.
Okay.
For example,
well, I don't think we need an example, because I want to make sure we get as many questions as possible. So I think we've got enough to go on at this point. Can you speak to that?
Oh yeah, definitely. First of all, I want to say that we're not really sure about the good that religion can do. I would admit that religion can do good in certain situations, but that overall, I think that it's harmful to society because it gives us a false picture of reality. As for what good atheist organizations can do, I mean, you could just look at the local atheist organization here in town. They volunteer frequently. I think they've adopted a highway. There's all kinds of charitable organization. I used to be the head, and it said in the bio at the beginning of an organization. We adopted a highway. We volunteered at soup kitchens. We did things that were good for the community because we believe that we have to give back to the community and so forth, like these general charitable ideas. I guess that's kind of answering the question, maybe?
Okay, well, let me say something on behalf of the atheists, which is that I think truth is valuable as an end in and of itself. And if I were an atheist, Obviously, I would be convinced, as I argued tonight, that it's a very bleak picture of the universe. I mean, we've kind of seen on display here what a high price you have to pay to be an atheist. But if that were in fact true, it seems to me that there would be some value, of course no ultimate value, because I'm atheist and there is no ultimate value, but there would be some value to at least me personally in facing reality for what it is. And one of the things I admire about my opponent here tonight is that unlike a lot of these contemporary atheists who like to go whistling through the graveyard and pretending that their little bubble meaning can somehow constitute ultimate meaning, that he's a consistent atheist and he consistently faces the implications of his atheism, and I respect that a great deal.
Thank you. Next question.
Hey, okay, so I'm really interested in when you were talking about objective morality, and in a way I want to ask, is the murder weapon liable morally for the murder? I want to explain. So even a morality that all humans agree upon is still subjective. It's from the human point of view, right? So an objective morality would have to be a morality to which everything, every atom is beholden. So could an objective morality, the only one I could think of would be the laws of physics. That's the only morality that everything seems to follow. So could an objective morality be anything other than physical law? Could it be transcendental? Could it be a proof for God?
Well, I guess I would disagree with that. I think only a moral agent is subject to a moral code or a moral value. I mean, when a lion goes out and kills an antelope, none of us say that the lion has murdered the antelope. When one hyena steals in on another animal's kill and runs off with it, we don't say, other than speaking metaphorically, that he stole it. And that's because we don't view lions and hyenas as moral agents. So if even animals can't be moral agents, much less can inanimate objects. So I don't see that that has any bearing against the argument that I've offered for the existence of objective moral values. And remember, I defined what I mean by objective, which is a moral value with a corresponding duty to conform to that value that's valid and binding regardless of whether or not anyone believes that it's the case. So if there's any one thing at all about which you'd be prepared to say that thing is evil, I don't care if everybody in the world thinks it's okay, then you believe in objective moral values as I have defined them. And my argument would be that the atheist then has to provide some account for why those values exist. Why am I obligated to conform my life to them?
I think that every person, as I said before, shares a core morality around the globe. I think that the theories of sociobiology can best explain this type of thing. The religious or philosophical traditions to explain morality really can't explain these facts about the world. Otherwise, everyone would embrace the other traditions of the philosophy or the religion that explains these facts. But because all of these traditions, philosophical, religious, have different ideas about what moral laws can be, as opposed to the core morality, I think that it proves all of them generally false. I also think that what this gentleman brought up is kind of important because it also makes me wonder that if a plausibly personal God, like Dr. Marshall suggested, existed, why would he create an animal kingdom that depended on rape and murder and pointless barbarism? I mean, the only way that a duck can impregnate another duck is by rape. That's just the way it is. You know, if there was a plausibly personal God, so much pain wouldn't be caused to creatures around the globe.
Next question.
Hello, I was wondering what you thought is the evolutionary benefit of core morality. Because I know you said that morality helps us coexist with other humans, but if we are animals, then why can't we coexist with other humans like animals do without morality?
I would say that animals have a core morality. There's been several studies with orangutans, chimpanzees, and our nearest cousins evolutionarily, and they do have the same type of morality. all the societies that orangutans and bonobos live, or except for bonobos, are patriarchal societies, meaning that the men rule the societies in the same way that Homo sapiens are a patriarchal society. But there's lots of sociobiologists that say that a society like the bonobos would be a better society because it's ran by the females. But that's just a general idea.
I don't need to make an expansive comment on this. I don't think it's difficult to show how moral values could be beneficial to our species. I think that's fairly easy for the evolutionists to do. And the real question is, do those values have any status beyond that? Because if they don't, then as I say, they're simply a biological and sociological spin-off, and it seems to me that if I'm a pedophile or a serial killer or whatever, that there's no reason for me not to flout the herd morality if that's what I choose to do.
Another question?
All right. Do you guys believe that there's a fault in the theory of relativity? And you spoke of God, but what God makes the most sense to you? So that's two questions.
Okay, well, neither of us are physicists, and so I don't feel that I'm in a position to point out faults in Einstein's theory of relativity as it's been modified. But the theory of relativity has led to the Big Bang and all the implications that I talked about tonight. And it really is indisputable. We've had some back and forth about the scientific evidence, and those of you who want to read this for yourself, I just invite you to come down tonight and pick up a copy of this article from New Scientist. As to what kind of God that I believe in, I think the evidence demands that whatever it is, be eternal, be immaterial, that he transcends space and time. Obviously, it has to be immensely powerful, and I've given a couple of reasons for why it's a plausibly personal being, that is a mind or intelligent agent.
I don't really have any comments.
Okay. Next question.
Mr. Sorry, I forgot.
Drum.
Yes.
Mr. Drum.
Okay. You mentioned near the end of the debate that evolution is evidence towards the non-existence of God, because he would not have had to use naturalism to attain life as we know it today. But if it was his intention, if it were true that it was his intention to use that form of creation, what difference would it make what you think or what I think or what anyone in this room thinks about how he should or should not have gone about doing it?
I would just say that it's illogical, that if we believe in it, that a God could be logical. It doesn't make logical sense that he would use a naturalistic explanation. If we were special, if we were a special and individual creation that really popped out of God 10,000 years ago, and he broke off Adam's rib and made Eve, according to Genesis 2, right? Then, I mean, there wouldn't be evolutionary evidence for this. That's what I'm generally saying. That the evidence of evolution disproves a lot of the theories of origins that religions say. Thank you.
Well, as far as the bearing on this, on the evidence for the existence of God, as I said earlier tonight, I just don't see how the argument carries. I grant that if evolution is true, it poses certain problems to say Genesis' account of the origin of mankind, but that's not the question before us tonight. The question is whether or not God exists. And Philip Drum's argument here is that, well, I know that if there were a God, it just wouldn't make any sense for him to create a universe that is all causally, physically connected like this. And I just think that that's a tremendous leap. Why? I mean, as philosopher Stephen Wickstra says, any being big enough to create the heavens and earth gives a high conditional probability just from the outset that we'd regularly be unable to discern his purposes. And I'm not just throwing down the mystery card, just at random here, but what I'm saying is that while we ought to be able to give some rationale for God to do what he does, it's absurd for us to suppose that if there were a God, that our little minds could comprehend the reason for everything that he does.
I'm going to disappoint the folks a lot on the left, but we've got time for one more question from each side. So we're going to hear one more question from here, one more question from here, and then we will give time for closure. Your question?
First things first, I want to thank you both for coming out, and I'll go ahead and get to my question. The church endorsed slavery for centuries and found Bible passages to support that position. Then when public opinion changed, the church changed along with it. What is the point of religion when it is as beholden to moral relativism as every other institution? If God cannot distinguish between right and wrong, regardless of paradigm, then how is God the answer when it comes to our morals? Thanks.
Well, this is part of a larger question about the fruits of religion in general and of Christianity, particularly in the history of civilization. Now, it's commonly said that Christianity in particular has this terrible past behind it, and I just simply think that that's not true. I've studied the history of the West long and hard. I mean, it's a remarkable fact that only in the Christian West did modern science arise. Only in the Christian West did these ideas of the intrinsic value of human beings arise. Only in the Christian West did the idea come to end slavery, which has been a human constant forever. But of course, my argument tonight has not been for Christianity. It's simply been for some kind of theism. And if atheism is true, you have no grounds whatsoever for thinking that slavery is wrong. There's nothing to prevent the strong from subjugating the weak. You have no grounds for asserting that. So if you really do believe that that's evil, then I'd encourage you to at least be a theist so that you can have a ground for that assertion, regardless of what you may think of particular forms of theism, such as Christianity.
I don't really have a comment on that.
Thanks. Our last question of the evening.
Good evening, sir. From my understanding from one of your previous answers from a question, speculated that life originated from amino acids spontaneously existed as empirically proven. If that is the case, how do you empirically explain the necessity and or advantage of the evolution from amino acids into heterosexually reproduced organic life?
I just created an evolutionary advantage. I mean, I really don't know how to answer that question, man. It really seems like you don't understand the basics of the theory of evolution. Evolutionary advantages are created because certain offspring have a better ability to survive. So the idea that we are now two sexes, that the chromosomes split from X and Y, which actually did happen approximately 300 million years ago, according to biogeneticists or whoever, that's the belief. So it gave us some evolutionary advantage. And actually, I read an article recently that the Y chromosome is on the way out. It's actually losing a lot of its data to the X, and that according to some people, they believe that at approximately 50,000 years that humanity will split back into a single species. But who knows, right?
I think I'll pass on that.
This went weird on him.
All righty, we are coming close, but one of the ways that a debate typically closes is that each speaker takes a few minutes to basically say, here's why I won the night. And we will begin with Dr. Marston.
Well, in conclusion tonight, I'd just like to recap the arguments that I have made and the responses I've made to Philip Drum's arguments in favor of atheism. Now, with regard to the Kalam cosmological argument, we've had some disagreement as to where the scientific evidence points. I've given you lots of quotations from different scientists, many of them atheists, such as Stephen Hawking, Alexander Vilenkin is an agnostic, Roger Penrose is an agnostic, Alan Guth is an agnostic, and they're all conceding that the universe can't be past eternal. And I just encourage you, if you're in doubt about the scientific evidence, to come down here and at least pick up this article here and read a little bit about it. As for the philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past, my opponent's only answer to that has been to say, well, philosophy is useless. And I just think that's absurd. And it's rather a strange commentary on the state that atheism has come to, that a number of atheists now are forced to eschew philosophy. And in so doing, they can't really eschew philosophy. Doing philosophy is inescapable. Philosophy has to do with defining terms and rules for thinking and conceptual analyses, and that's simply unavoidable in any type of clear thinking, especially thinking about the big questions of human life. And if the universe had a beginning, then you're faced with one of two options, as I argued. Either the universe just sprang into existence, uncaused, out of nothing, with no cause whatsoever, like sheer magic, or it originated from a transcendent cause. And I think it's perfectly obvious which of those is the more logical alternative. At the very least, I think the atheist has to concede that it's more plausible that being will arise from some former kind of being, namely a transcendent cause's creative power, than it just coming out of nothing. As for the argument from fine-tuning, all I heard in response to that, again, is a questioning of the science, that you have to describe what life is or under what conditions life can exist. Well, that's all done in the literature. Life is the ability to take in energy, to grow, to take in food, to extract energy from it, and to grow and to reproduce. And the argument is simply that without these constants being tuned to this incredible degree of precision that they are, life would not be possible in the universe. Again, this is just de rigueur in the scientific literature. As Luke Barnes of the Sydney Institute for Astronomy says, there are a great many scientists of varying religious persuasions who accept the universe is fine-tuned for intelligent life. Barrow, Carr, Carter, Davies, Dawkins, Deutsch, Ellis, Green, Guth, Garrison, Hawking, Lynn, Page, Penrose, Polkinghorne, Reed, Sandage, Smolin, Susskind, Tegmark, Tipler, Vilenkin, Weinberg, Wheeler, and Wilczek. So the fine-tuning is very well established in the literature. There can't be any serious disagreement about whether it's a real phenomenon of our universe, and it's a phenomenon that is very difficult to account for on atheism. To my last argument, the moral argument for God's existence, as I said earlier, I applaud my opponent here for his consistency in conceding the first premise of that argument, that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But then that puts him up against the second premise, since he's an atheist, that objective moral values and duties do exist, so that he's forced, as any real consistent atheist is, to have these incredibly strong and powerful moral intuitions inside them, and yet to do violence to them in his meta-theory. I think Bertrand Russell, in a letter to the Observer in 1957, Bertrand Russell, a famous atheist philosopher of the 20th century, who, like my opponent tonight, was a consistent atheist in this regard, expressed this dilemma of the atheist very well. He said, "What Mr. Toynbee, who had written against him, says in criticism of my views on ethics has my entire sympathy. I find my own views, that there is no objective morality, incredible. I do not know the solution." That is, he's convinced of it intellectually in his mind, but it's unlivable. And so if your philosophical theory commits you to a code of life that is unlivable, that you really can't even cognitively function with, and we haven't even talked about its implications for the reliability of our cognitive faculties, for the existence of meaning and beauty, but certainly at the level of having to say that there's nothing really objectively wrong with raping and torturing a little child, with child sacrifice and these kinds of things, with slavery, as the last questioner asked. That's a high price to pay. And I just want to ask you, have you heard sufficient grounds for believing that those things really are not evil tonight? Thank you.
I hope that I've shed some light tonight on why atheism holds some evidence and why philosophy is not good at answering the questions before us. These scientific ideas that I've been talking about are not meant to fulfill some deep need or satisfy you in the way that religion will. And I've only attempted to relay a little bit of knowledge that I have about this scientific field. You can research it more for yourself if you'd like. I didn't come here tonight to shoot down a system of beliefs, or any beliefs, or to be negative to those with faith, or to insult anyone for having a belief in a higher power. My only purpose was to try to have a meaningful conversation with someone else who had a different set of principles and beliefs for understanding the world. These different beliefs also hold very important consequences for our society, for how we can talk about if we can build a just society, or what that would even mean. These are very important questions. Now, I questioned Wallace's way of coming up with evidence, and he asked if it was the best. I showed a little bit about what science has to say. Personally, I believe that knowledge can only come from observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. I also come here as a humanist to establish a relationship with a community of people I would have never met. If you haven't figured it out, I'm not going to be going to church with most people here that are Christian, and I want to come and talk and have a conversation with people about these kinds of things. We know it's important as a society to have these types of conversations. We're all social beings, and we all hopefully find great happiness in our family and friends. Everyone among us has a goal of living a happy life, and we all strive and had hard times. We all can do more together than we ever could have individually. I came here tonight to tell you that I have a different set of views about the universe, but that doesn't mean I'm immoral. That doesn't mean that I'm crazy or a bad person. And I'm not different from any other human being you know who isn't a psychopath. I felt the agony when my friends died. I felt a deep and fulfilling love for my girlfriend. I believe that being an atheist intensifies these feelings, intensifies happiness, and makes food taste better. And it even makes sex better, if you guys didn't know that. I believe that when our brains stop producing consciousness, we cease to exist as humans. And that makes me cherish the here and now more than anything. Thank you.
All right, so where do we land after all of this? Synthesis and compromise seems highly unlikely. But we have heard a lot today, recently, about tolerance and diversity. And we often fail to remember that the road to tolerance and diversity is not to stop believing or even to stop debating where appropriate. That choice is what we might call cheap tolerance. Such tolerance is impossible and even unwise. We need to remember, and I think Phillip did a great job of beginning to talk about this, that tolerance and diversity don't really kick in until we disagree. To be tolerant is to admit disagreement. It's the starting line, not the finish line. We can agree to disagree without being disagreeable. We can remain open-minded where appropriate. And we can find lots of common ground around which to build relationships. And I invite you to continue those conversations beyond this forum, and certainly starting tonight in just a few minutes.
If you need a ride to the Carolina Ale House, we do have some cars available, so feel free just to gather down here, and I'm sure we can hook you up with something.
But you'll have to stumble back.
Yes. And you can check out the bumper stickers to decide which car you should go into. If it's a fish,
we do take
yes.
atheists on our side.
If it's something eating a fish. Okay. Two more things before I go. First of all, we've decided, since we have the suits, we are going to start a boy band, and we will do some karaoke at the Ale House. So we'll figure that out. But the biggest thanks of the night, other than to our guests, is to Emma Hilton, who kept time and kept us all on schedule. So thank you so much for that. That was our closest link to objective reality here tonight. And now I'd like to invite Tom Jaski to come up and close us out.
Okay, if you would join me in thanking again Phillip Drum and Wallace Marshall and then Dr. Olson for moderating it. My name's Tom Jaski. I'm the chapter director here for Ratio Christi at UNCW, which is Latin for reason of Christ, the reasonableness, the rationality of Christ. And one of the things that we do as an organization here on campus are sponsor events like this. We are unapologetically a Christian apologetics organization, but what we like to do is sponsor events, sponsor debates, dialogues, opportunities on the university campus where people can share the truths, the evidence, reason, and share ideas as we should on a university campus and dialogue and see where is truth. Where do we end up with truth? And just to highlight, we have 2 more events coming up this spring that you may be interested in. Tentatively, April 1st, we have 2 of our own here at UNCW in the science department, Dr. Bailey and Dr. Morgan, who will be having a dialogue, not a debate, a dialogue on creationism and evolution that is tentatively scheduled in Cameron Hall on April 1st. And we also have on April 14th, Dr. Marshall will be returning, and we'll be engaging in the debate appropriately right before Easter on the resurrection. And that would will be held here again in Lumina Theater. So if you'd like to find out more about Ratio Christi and what we're doing here, you can talk to me afterwards. You can talk to Aaron Marshall, who was one of the camera guys in the white shirt there. We'll be standing out back there. If you want to find out what we're doing, if you want to help out, we'd be glad to do that. But thanks so much for coming, and drive safely on the way back from Carolina Ale House. Yes. April 1st is for real. It is for real. All right. Thank y'all. Have a good night.